Good morning, everyone. My name is Marzia Zafar. I'm joined by my colleague, Pauline Blanc. We are your hosts for today's webinar and also the co-authors of the Council's Hydrogen Brief. Thank you, everyone, for joining us so early in the morning and from all over the world. We hope the next 45 to 50 minutes is an interactive town hall type of session where we all learn from each other. A few housekeeping things before we start. The way we will run this webinar is sort of like a town hall meeting. We have three guest experts that Pauline and I will interview, starting with a couple of starter questions and then hoping and relying on you to ask most of the questions. And I can tell you in a second how to ask those questions. Our guests are Nigel Brandon, Dean of the Faculty of Engineering at Imperial College here in London, Craig Knight, Director of Industrial Solutions for Horizon Fuel Cell Technology, and Dan Sadler, H21 Project Manager for Equinor. We interviewed each of these three gentlemen as part of our Insights Brief, and they are all equipped to answer all of your policy, vision, as well as, of course, technical questions around hydrogen. Now, how can you ask questions? You can submit your questions via that little icon, question icon. You can either tell us if you want to be named or remain anonymous. We will read the question aloud and direct it to one of our guest speakers. If you would like to share a comment, please do the same. Use the same icon and please identify if you want to be named or not. And because we have over 100 people on this webinar, we have turned off the talk function because it will be a mess to talk over each other. So those are the logistics. Before we jump into questions, I want to tell you why the Council is working on hydrogen and ask you a question. First, the Council has a presence in nearly 100 countries. And with that, we have a very wide network of energy policymakers, innovators, and doers who shape the energy agendas at national, regional, and global scale. And the Council's goal is to bring solutions that can be affordable, reliable, and secure as you go through your energy transitions. Hydrogen, we think, is a solution that enables a decarbonized energy system, and that's why we've been looking at use cases that have a decent shot at making this happen. So that's why we're involved. Now, let me ask you something. And yes, I believe there's about 135 people on the line, all 135 of you. The question that will pop up on your screen, and you simply have to choose an answer that best fits your perspective. The question is, in which sector do you see hydrogen playing a role in 2040? A, mobility, B, heat, C, industrial processes, D, power generation, E, all of the above, or F, none of the above. Please do us a favor and click on one of them. I will give you a few more seconds to click on the response of your choice. Okay. You guys are almost there? Okay, now, thank you for submitting that. I'm also going to ask you a question at the end of the webinar, so it'll be the same process, and then we'll share the information with everybody. Okay, I want to now quickly ask Pauline, who is the main author of the hydrogen work that we did, to give you a brief of the findings of our exploratory interviews, which is the basis of our hydrogen brief. Pauline, take it away.
Thank you very much, Marzia. And good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining this webinar. So working with our members, the Council produces 3 flagship tools, which I'm sure you have heard of. We have the Trilemma, the Issues Monitor, the Scenarios. And since last year, the Innovation Workstream has been focusing on emerging trends and their potential to impact on energy systems. And the topic of hydrogen was selected based on the Issues Monitor survey. This is a global survey of energy leaders, which we have been conducting every year since 2009. And what we noticed is that in the past few years, the survey displayed a heightened sense of urgency to mainstream the production and consumption of hydrogen for some of our Asian member committees, specifically Korea, China, and Japan. And when we started focusing on the topic, the main question that we asked ourselves was whether hydrogen was going through another hype cycle like in the 70s or the 2000s, or whether there was realistic hope this time around. We conducted 36 interviews in 18 countries, and we interviewed people in countries at the forefront of the hydrogen uptake in Japan, Korea, Germany, UK, as well as in countries which are trying to position themselves in order to make the most of it, such as France, Australia, Chile, Saudi Arabia. And the conclusion from these interviews is that all the science points toward the fact that hydrogen is here to stay. And this is because of a series of coexisting factors. We have the implementation of climate change policies around the world and the need to find decarbonization solutions beyond electrification. We have the fact that falling renewable prices is opening new opportunities for green hydrogen produced via electrolysis. And we have the fact as well that growing hydrogen government targets, namely China, which seems to be replicating what it did with solar and batteries. And from our interviews, this is driven by air pollution concerns, but Craig can tell us a little bit more about it in a second. So for example, in 2018, the subsidy for fuel cell passenger vehicles was about $30,000 for each car, and $44,000 to $74,000 for a small-sized truck or buses. But despite the many projects and government commitments which are being announced all around the world, hydrogen still has many important obstacles to overcome. And these include the price of clean hydrogen itself, but also the hardware to use. And another key challenge is the infrastructure to store and transport hydrogen. A key question is whether we can repurpose existing infrastructure or whether we're talking about new infrastructure. These are similar challenges that in the past, but we're convinced that this time around, climate urgency and the requirement for seasonal storage are definitely changing the game.
Thank you, Pauline. I have some of my own questions, or some of our own questions, but yesterday we got a couple of questions from you guys. I'll go ahead and start with that to encourage more questions coming in. One of the questions that we got, and this goes to Dan, actually, if Professor Brandon, if you could take this on, that would be great. The question is, I would like to ask the experts, what do they think about the deployment of hydrogen blended with natural gas for the reduction of CO2 emissions in household heating? What are the main limitations and challenges? And is it possible to think of a quota policy like the ones in biofuels? I know that's a mouthful. Let me know if you need clarification, Professor.
No, it's fine. I can have a go at that. So the ability to put hydrogen into natural gas, obviously we can do that. It depends on the rules and regulations in the country, and different countries have different rules and regulations. The UK, for example, has a rather tight specification on the amount of hydrogen that can be blended into natural gas. Other countries like Germany have a higher specification. So I think from a safety point of view, there's a general consensus that you could put perhaps, say, 10% by volume hydrogen into natural gas, possibly more than that, without difficulty. That's helpful in providing a market for hydrogen at the early stage of its adoption. 10% by volume of hydrogen in a natural gas grid is actually, of course, a very large amount of hydrogen. It is, however, nowhere near sufficient to meet the carbon abatement targets, because whilst it lowers the carbon footprint of that gas, it's not significantly lowering it. So for me, it's an interesting opportunity to bootstrap up the market for hydrogen, for low carbon hydrogen, but it's not an end destination. If we wanted to go to higher contents of hydrogen in natural gas, then you start to need to think about the end use applications, because if you're going to burn that, you need to think about it changes the combustion characteristics and the flame characteristics, so you need to adapt the burner. If we wanted to go to 100% hydrogen, there's a lot of work going on at the moment. There's quite a bit here in the UK to understand just what is involved in converting an existing gas network into a hydrogen carrying gas network. I think the general view at the moment is that there's nothing kind of there's no fundamental barrier to that, but we do need to look at the specifics and absolutely confirm the safety case for it, and that's work that's going on at the moment.
So, Professor, doing the interviews and also just my own background working for Southern California Gas Company for a while, I thought that there was a technical barrier in that the pipelines themselves, not the transmission pipelines, but the distribution pipelines, needed to be either coated with something or replaced from. Is there any technical barriers?
Yeah, so that is the case, that and your report mentions it, that it depends what the pipelines are made of. In the UK, we've been replacing our old metal pipes with plastic pipes, and those plastic pipes are safe to carry hydrogen. Hydrogen has a couple of characteristics that make it difficult to move around. One is it's a very small molecule, so it's very good at leaking out of little gaps. So you have to look at the leak integrity of the pipe. And secondly, it can embrittle certain types of metals, which obviously creates a mechanical problem. But with plastics, that's fine. So for the low pressure end of the system, that sort of solution is fine. There's quite a different set of challenges at the high, if you have a high pressure distribution system. But for the majority of the pipelines that deliver, for example, hydrogen to individual homes and buildings, then effectively relining the existing metal pipeline with a plastic lining, which is good to do anyway to prevent natural gas leakage, which is the motivation behind the program. Is in the UK, where we have a relatively old gas infrastructure, we don't want that methane to leak because it's it's a potent greenhouse gas. So that our expectation, but the work's going on at the moment to absolutely demonstrate it, is that by these replacement plastic linings will enable that pipeline to be used for up to 100% hydrogen.
Thank you. So another question that we got, and I will throw this to all of all three experts. This is a question that keeps coming on. So somebody asked us yesterday, even if you could produce hydrogen cheaper, because falling renewable prices or whatever have you, now that you produce hydrogen, great. What about transporting hydrogen from where you're producing it to the demand centers? The transport of hydrogen is still very expensive. So I'd like to maybe start with Craig, if you could let me know what your thought is on this, on the cost of transport. Craig, can you hear me? Then Professor Brandon, since I have you on the line nice and smooth, can you take this on while I figure out how I can turn on Craig's audio?
Sure. I mean, there are a range of choices. And while we talk about hydrogen, we could also think about other hydrogen carriers like ammonia. So it will depend a lot. It will depend on how far you want to move the hydrogen and the scale you want to move it. You can move hydrogen at the smaller scales with trailers and tube trailers, as you can move it at the longer scales with pipelines, and you can move it internationally, at least in principle, with shipping, a bit like LNG. That said, shipping liquid hydrogen, which is much colder than liquid natural gas, is as yet not commonly done, and we are aware that there is a program in Japan to build a ship to do that and to demonstrate how well that works. There's certainly quite a strong set of interests at the moment, in principle, in also thinking about taking that hydrogen to ammonia, and then ammonia is much easier to move around the world, and then cracking it back into hydrogen, or even using the ammonia. So these things do incur costs, but I have to say that putting in large cables to move low carbon electricity around is also a very expensive thing to do. And in fact, moving energy by pipe is a lot cheaper than moving it down a copper wire at scale. So any transition we make in which we want to move large amounts of low carbon energy around will incur significant infrastructure costs. And in fact, it's the infrastructure cost benefits, in my view, that are one of the major benefits of hydrogen. In other words, it's cheaper from an infrastructure perspective, despite these issues that, yes, hydrogen pipelines are expensive.
It's cheaper because we have some existing infrastructure already.
It may be where we could repurpose infrastructure. That obviously generates a cost saving. But we have to compare the overall cost of transitioning to a low carbon energy system with hydrogen and without hydrogen, or with a hydrogen carrier and without a hydrogen carrier. So we know that a transition to a low carbon energy system will incur cost. It's a matter of what's the overall lowest cost that brings you to an energy system that is socially acceptable and sustainable.
Great.
So that's where the balance of infrastructure costs need to be taken into account, and one of the merits that hydrogen has as a low carbon molecule is that we can move large amounts of it relatively affordably, because moving large amounts of low carbon electricity is also extremely expensive.
Okay, thank you, Craig. So can you go ahead and take this on? I think I think we've turned you on, turned your volume on. Okay, so I'm gonna move it back to Dan then. Dan, what do you think of this? The cost of transport, is it cost prohibitive? Does that make hydrogen cost prohibitive?
Well, firstly, can you hear me okay?
Yes. If you could speak a little bit louder, that would be great.
Yeah, so I've not been able to hear a lot of the webinar, so apologies, guys. Do you mean the cost of transport within the networks?
Yeah, so one of the questions that we got yesterday from the participants is, great if hydrogen is going to be cost effective in producing it, but what about the cost of transporting hydrogen from the production to the demand centers?
Yeah, I mean, the reality is the cost of transporting the hydrogen is minimal versus the cost of producing it at any scale. I mean, once you start getting into your gigawatt capacities, it's a different ballgame. So if you're looking at the H21 North of England report, the recommendation there was that you build a new transmission system, and that's partly because you need your existing transmission system to maintain gas supplies, but also to ensure the integrity of the pipeline. But the big prize is if you can reuse the thousands upon thousands of existing gas distribution network that's already in place. So, nothing's cheaper than a do-nothing option, but noting do-nothing isn't an option. What we've got gas networks all over the world that have the right capacity to transport hydrogen with the same level of energy security. So it's the big cost element is the production at the scale. It's not the transportation.
Okay. I'm gonna try Craig with my fingers crossed. Craig, can you hear us?
I can hear you. I've been able to hear you all along.
Oh, perfect. And now we can hear you. So
okay. I had a small problem. I was connected to the webinar, but I was also connected via a phone call because I thought it would be better audio quality, but I could not get the thing to unmute from the phone call. And unfortunately, your unmuting on the webinar app didn't work on the phone call. So I'm sorry about that.
Oh, it's okay. It's okay. So I think, we've heard from Professor Brandon and from Dan about the transport. If you'd like to talk about that, that would be great. And I also want to ask you about China, because as we were interviewing in the exploratory interviews, we stumbled onto China when we were talking to you, and you told us about the tremendous amount of subsidies that they're putting forth into this effort. So if you could actually tell our attendees a little about that, that would be great.
Absolutely. So firstly, thanks very much for having me, and I'm really sorry about the technology problems. I will make one comment about the transport or kind of energy delivery consideration. I think one of the greatest benefits of hydrogen, besides some of the comments already made, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hello?
Yes,
yeah.
We can hear.
Besides some of the comments already made in the effort to decarbonize, I think one of the terrific benefits of hydrogen is also the capacity to make it where you need it. So obviously with traditional energy infrastructure, there is very little flexibility to make energy where you need it. The only thing you can do is generate power from something like solar, which tends to make the power not necessarily when you need it. Whereas with hydrogen, obviously, if you can generate it where you need it, then you get away from all of the transmission issues of traditional power grids and traditional utility infrastructure. So I think that's a great benefit of hydrogen that can manifest itself in many ways. Now to just comment on China, that's a bit of a jump, I realize, in topics, but if people are interested in a little context on China, the major push within China on hydrogen is transport related, and this is mostly about both air quality improvement and energy independence. So as everybody is probably aware, China has moved in the last 25, 30 years to electrify light vehicles such as scooters and small cars and that sort of stuff, to get them off combustion engines. And anyone that's been to China in the last 20 years would have seen that the streets are littered with scooters, but none of them are combustion engines. They're all battery-based scooters racing around. So China pushed heavily to electrify those, small vehicles, getting away from the small, smelly, two-stroke engines and that sort of stuff that used to power those things years ago. Excuse me. And we're very successful in basically banning combustion engines on some of those lightweight vehicle classes from cities. They just banned them from cities. Then in more recent times, the government has realized that a lot of the air quality problems around the cities were more from the diesel engines of urban buses and delivery trucks, parcel van type delivery trucks, doing pretty heavy duty cycles of driving around the city all day, moving passengers or parcels. And these vehicle classes contribute, to a lot of the air pollution. So the government has introduced incentives to move those vehicle platforms onto an electric base. The problem is that with heavy duty cycles, you can't really survive on batteries alone because you don't have enough time to charge the vehicles in between, usage patterns. So by going to hydrogen fuel cell electric vehicles, where the usage is a lot more like it is with a liquid fuel, diesel or in particular, your kind of use case scenario doesn't change. You drive it for 5 or 6 hours and you go back to base and you fill it up with fuel, and then the next driver drives it for 5 or 6 hours and comes back and fills it up with fuel, and then another driver can do it for 5 or 6 hours. So the use case is very similar from diesel to hydrogen, and that's the great benefit when moving to these high utilization heavier vehicles like buses and trucks and so on. So the lessons in China are, I think, very poignant, because people are looking at moving from diesel to electric for buses and trucks in some parts of the world, and so they're introducing battery-based systems, which is fine for some use cases, but for the high utilization scenarios that the batteries can't manage.
Let me jump in and just ask, we got a question from the audience saying, what about the 400,000 plus electric buses operational in China? So I guess the question,
Yes.
let me change that a little bit. If China has 400 or 500,000 electrical buses, why focus on hydrogen? Is there something different? Is it cheaper? Is it better? Why focus on it?
Okay, that's a great question. So the 400,000 electric buses in China are exactly why the government is focusing on hydrogen now, because the 400,000 buses can do so much, but you can't get to 100% penetration. There are many, many hundreds of thousands of buses more that are still running on diesel. So you can't get to the high utilization bus deployments on batteries alone. You need something that functions a bit more like the way that the liquid fueled systems work, and that's what hydrogen does for those bus deployments. So there are certainly there's certainly a lot of value in battery electric buses, and yes, there are almost 500,000 battery electric buses in China, which represents well over 90% of the global base of battery electric buses. But China knows better than anybody where the limitations of those systems are and why hydrogen is a good idea. And that's why they're now pushing hydrogen, and they've backed off the incentives on battery-based systems because they've realized that they're hitting the ceiling on the relevance of pure battery electric buses, for example.
Great, thank you so much. The next question I'm going to direct it to Professor Brandon. It comes from Miko Veronin. I hope I pronounced that name correctly. How do you see utilization of hydrogen in methanol production and storing, transporting, and use?
Okay, so yeah, this is methanol is indeed a potential liquid carrier of hydrogen. If we make that methanol not from natural gas, but you know, we utilize a low carbon hydrogen as part of the synthesis process for that methanol. Methanol had a lot of interest in the early days, let's say, of hydrogen or fuel cell cars, where there was a lot of focus on using methanol as the liquid carrier and then converting that using an onboard reformer on the vehicle into hydrogen that would then run a hydrogen fuel cell vehicle. And there was an awful lot of interest in that a number of years ago. The automotive companies moved away from methanol for their transport applications because of technical challenges in balance in the size of the reformer and in the transient response, essentially, of the integrated methanol reformer fuel cell system, and moved to compressed hydrogen, which is what we see today in the buses that Craig has just mentioned, and in the cars that are driving around the roads today. So it's a good question. You could certainly use methanol. Methanol is not without its challenges. It is a carcinogenic material, so one has to clearly make certain it's safely contained, and it also is water soluble. So you have to be very careful that it doesn't leak and get in, because it can go into the water. So there are some challenges with methanol, but there's absolutely, you know, if we wanted to effectively revisit and go back to a liquid hydrogen carrier, methanol would be certainly a candidate for that. I'm not seeing a huge focus on it when I look around at what people are doing today. There seems to be a stronger focus on ammonia rather than methanol as a carrier for the sort of an alternative bulk distribution of hydrogen. And there indeed are other liquid carriers like dimethyl ether that one might consider as a liquid carrier of the hydrogen. So it's there's no reason we couldn't look at it. I'm not seeing a huge amount of interest in it.
Okay. So we have a few more questions, and we have a statement, and I'm gonna read the statement aloud, and I'm gonna see if Dan has a observation on this. So the statement is, I think, from Antonio Fayad, and the statement is that 10% of volume of hydrogen that is currently possible to blend in the natural gas grid represents a problem to any end use, namely specifics as industry or CHP plants.
Yeah, so I think it's a funny thing, blending. I mean, obviously the H21 report is based on 100%, and I think blending is often oversimplified, and I think that statement is a good example of where it is oversimplified, because it's correct. I mean, if you've got CNG fueling station off your gas network, they can't accept more than a 2% blend. So, you know, blending, I think there's an argument that says, like Nigel said initially, blending may give an initial market for hydrogen production because it's connected to a gas network and people can use it. But we don't want to oversimplify that as saying, yeah, we can just stick it in anywhere, because we simply can't. I mean, there's issues with billing because it slightly lowers the calorific value. What are the end users that are in the specific areas? but also from a climate change perspective, you know, it's almost broadly irrelevant in the context of real climate change targets. You know, 10% blend is a 3% carbon saving. So unless you're going to get to 100%, it's kind of, well, why bother? And to get to 100%, then you have to adapt to the end use, so you solve the problem. So, you know, I think blending, it's a good point that it's often oversimplified. There will be applications where it's relevant. But the other thing that we seem to forget when we talk about blending, in terms of percentages of blend, is that we're not really talking on a scale where we get a ubiquitous, say, 10% blend in the UK. You know, I mean, that's a 10% blend in the UK is 30 terawatt hours of hydrogen, 30 million watt hours of hydrogen that would have to be distributed evenly. And there's an interseasonal swing in demand, which means that can't really happen. So what you might get is blending in local areas, this is my view, where there's significant constrained energy issues and where there's downstream end-use users that can access that blend safely. It provides a quick and easy market. But noting the timescale for meeting a 2060 climate change target, we need to be thinking much bigger than blending, and that's when you get into your gigawatt scale hydrogen production and conversion to 100%, which can play into heat, power generation, transport, or industrial decarbonisation.
Perfect. Thank you so much. So we got a question from India, and I will see of the three of you, whoever wants to answer. From an LCOE perspective, how are electric vehicles and hydrogen placed? And the experts, I'm afraid I don't know what LCOE is, so I'm hoping you guys do.
Levelized cost of energy, I imagine.
Ah, perfect. Thank you. So you can answer, Craig.
Oh, well, I wouldn't focus on the cost of energy when you talk about vehicles. I'd be focusing on the total system cost, because with a vehicle, you've got everything from obviously drivetrains and the bodies of the vehicle and the operation and maintenance, and you know, the cost of repair and replacement of worn and torn parts and all the rest of it through the life cycle of the vehicle. I would say that the full life cost of hydrogen-based fuel cell electric vehicles will be lower than internal combustion engine vehicles within the next 10 years. The main reasons for that are twofold. The first one is there is simply a lot less maintenance, and that's one of the things that we're learning in a market like China, where there are so many electric vehicles, that the maintenance costs are just so much lower than traditional ICE-based vehicles. The second thing is that residual value in the fuel cell, that's, you know, one of the main cost drivers of your vehicle. Residual value is relatively high to the company that's able to repurpose the platinum, and as probably almost everybody knows, you can repurpose, you know, 95% plus of the platinum that's in a fuel cell at end of life, and that's a significant cost driver in your system. But while the system cost is still higher today up front, I would argue that a 10-year whole of life cost, kind of total cost of ownership of a hydrogen-based system, can already be lower than diesel even today, but certainly within the next 10 years it'll be de rigueur that it's lower cost than ICE-based systems. I don't know what other people think of that, but that's certainly my view.
Any comments from Professor Brandon or Dan?
Yeah, I'll chip in. So, I mean, I agree with those points. I think you can also look at what's the cost relative to a battery electric. So those comments, I think, are absolutely valid, you know, comparing electric vehicles to internal combustion engine vehicles. I think it's really down to the sweet spot, which has already been mentioned by Craig, around you know, a hydrogen electric vehicle, a hydrogen fuel cell electric vehicle starts to win out economically over a battery electric vehicle as the range requirements go up, so the amount of energy you need on the vehicle goes up, or as the size of the vehicle goes up, so the energy needed goes up, because battery costs, you know, scale linearly. You know, you need 10 times the energy, you need 10 times the battery, so the weight and cost of that goes up. So there's a trade-off between vehicle size and duty cycle, where on purely economic grounds, the hydrogen fuel cell version of that electric vehicle will become a cheaper vehicle to operate than the battery electric vehicle. So that's the direction of travel, and hydrogen fuel cell electric vehicles share many of the components of the battery electric vehicle. So all of the advances that are being made in electric motors, in control architecture, in inverters, are equally valid to a hydrogen fuel cell electric vehicle as a battery electric vehicle. The difference really I would point to is obviously the fuel cell is one difference, and the other difference is the hydrogen tank. And I think those hydrogen tanks are an area where we need to see costs down. At the moment, they're rather bespoke, handmade, almost, and therefore expensive. And therefore, looking at moving those to a mass manufacturing scale is going to be important to take out quite a lot of the cost of a current hydrogen fuel cell electric vehicle.
Thank you so much. So Dan, before you respond, let me throw another question at you so you can respond to both. We keep getting this question in different forms. This is from Ben Smith. The question is, should we just not bother with blending and aim for going straight to 100% hydrogen?
Yeah, so it's another good question. I mean, what we often forget with these debates is to put the context of time into perspective for significant changes to the energy system. So the reality is that talking about blending on a small scale where you've got some constrained energy is not actually a particularly strong climate change argument. It's an economic argument, and it's maybe a beneficial argument for helping support the deployment and increase in the electrolyzer supply chain, for example, which is good. But the point is that the evidence for 100% conversion and the evidence for any sort of at-scale blending, which is never going to be much more than 10%, heroically optimistic, let's say 20, will actually be in place at the same time. And it's not like you do an incremental step to 10, then 20, then 30, then 40. Because once you start to get much above 10 or 20, depending on what's on the end of the network, you have to do this conversion to 100%. And if we're serious about the urgency of climate change and meeting climate change targets, in my view, we have to be doing much bigger, much more ambitious conversions. We've done gas conversions from town's gas to natural gas. We did that across the world in the UK. We did it in the UK 1966 to 1977. And my view is we have to be more ambitious, because if we can convert gas networks to 100% hydrogen, or even just build the transmission systems ready for those conversions, then what we're doing is providing bulk availability of hydrogen at point of use, which means you can use it for heat, or power generation. So my view is, blending may have some local benefits, and if you can do it and there's no issues, get on with it. But it's not actually, from a country or global perspective, solving the problem. It's playing nicely with politics as opposed to actually making real decisions.
Thank you. Professor, this question goes to you. We have lots more questions, so I'm gonna go through these. Professor Brandon, the question is, the chemical industry, including fertilizer, needs huge amounts of hydrogen as molecules. What is the potential to replace the fossil feedstock for these big centralized baseload type consumers? And the question is coming from Dirk Merrier.
Sure. I mean, it's a really good question, and it's a really good point, which is that if we're going to make low carbon hydrogen at scale, the first and best thing to do with it is to replace fossil hydrogen at scale. And that's the first thing we should do. It's a high value product, right? It's a molecule, it's not a fuel, and it carries more value, and it directly replaces a brown hydrogen from natural gas or from coal or however we're producing it. So it is the first thing we should do, which is to replace existing brown hydrogen with green hydrogen. There's no efficiency loss in a conversion process. It's a direct like for like. So absolutely great thing to do.
Okay. The next question is for Craig. Many countries like India are moving swiftly to electrify transport fleet. Do you see any possibility of countries moving directly to hydrogen in the medium term, or two-thirds wheelers will prefer being electric, and four-wheelers will go for hydrogen?
I think Professor Brandon very succinctly stated before the kind of natural trade-offs that emerge between battery electric and fuel cell electric. So in fact, these things kind of coexist and sit next to each other on these product maps. And if you listen to the likes of Toyota or Honda or Hyundai, if you listen to their ideas about where electrification is going, it's not battery versus fuel cell at all. And just like Professor Brandon said before, fuel cell utilizes all of the advances in electric drivetrain systems, electric motors, and all the other stuff that go into the DC-based power systems. So all of our balance of plant stuff is becoming, much more mature all the time for fuel cell electric because of battery electric innovation, which is terrific for all of us. And costs are coming down fairly rapidly. So these things kind of sit next to each other on a product map. Basically, if you've got a fairly light vehicle with a fairly modest duty cycle through the day, through its daily operation, then you can stick to a battery and you won't have any compromise. If you've got a heavier vehicle, physically heavier, as well as a more demanding utilization pattern through the 24-hour periods, then you will kind of be forced to use hydrogen because it's the only way that you can get to a high utilization on a daily basis. You just don't have time to charge in some of these applications. So there are some fuel cell based motive systems now that are running around 20 hours a day. And if you do that with batteries, I just don't know how you do that without a whole lot of battery changes and a whole lot of equipment to do so. And it's not a simple process at all to tear out batteries from these vehicles. So I do think that these technologies are complementary and they are helping each other actually, although a lot of people view it as an either or thing. We don't view it that way at all. And we see that the fuel cell broadens the applicability of electric vehicle systems. It starts with batteries and then it moves to fuel cells when you need more range or you need to power heavier duty, physically heavier vehicles and or operate more hours in a day, basically.
Okay. The next question, I think is a very important question. We've talked about this during the interview, so I'd like all three of you to respond to this, beginning with Dan, then Professor Brandon, then Craig. This is a safety question. The question comes to us from Stefan. How do you think that the 3 accidents in Norway, US, and South Korea will affect the near future development?
Yeah, I mean, well, with anything, you've got to have responsible operators. I mean, the gas industry, we need to put things in perspective. Accidents are regrettable, and obviously those need to be investigated. And like anything, there should be, and then safety systems should be put in place to manage them. But the gas industry historically is one of the safest industries in the world. In the UK, up to 90% of homes in cities have natural gas, which is an explosive flammable gas, just like hydrogen is an explosive flammable gas, just like town gas was an explosive gas in the homes. And this is not new stuff. What you do is you get responsible operators who have detailed asset management systems in place who can mitigate the risk. And we need to always quantify risk. I mean, on an all-electric world, there's a lot more people killed from electrocution than there are from gas problems, which is just a reality. So we have to manage the risk. But obviously, these incidents, it shows the need for proper regulation and proper monitoring, so that it's a managed rollout using the experts, so that incidents where you're carrying out or operating or managing any energy vector, safety issues are kept to an absolute minimum. But I'd like to think that specifically in mobility question, I mean, in terms of large-scale deployment of hydrogen for flexible power generation, for heat, for mobility, I don't think in the long term it should have a particularly detrimental effect, because the timescales and need is too great to get clean systems in place.
Okay, so actually, Craig and Professor Brandon, We have a lot of questions and a lot of really good ones with 5 minutes left. So let me move to the next question. And this goes to, excuse me, Professor Brandon. The overall losses from production to wheels are over 60% for hydrogen vehicles compared to 25 to 30% for EVs. Do you see these figures changing much in the next 10 years?
So yeah, it's true because each energy conversion step has a loss, and you can make hydrogen at about 70% efficiency with today's electrolyzers, and then convert that at about 70% efficiency to traction power using a fuel cell. I think the fuel cell efficiency number, and Craig might want to comment, but I think it's that whilst there may be technological advances that take out costs and all sorts of things, I think at the end of the day, you've got some thermodynamics in there which probably stick you at about 70% for the fuel cell as a max. There are some electrolyzer technologies which are not yet mature, which use high temperature electrolysis rather than low temperature, and high temperature electrolysis is thermodynamically much more favorable than low temperature, which could, if we scaled that up, significantly improve the efficiency of the electrolyzer step. At the moment, we don't have that technology available, but if we did, that would shift that electrolyzer efficiency, provided we also had a source of some low carbon heat, probably from a waste heat process, up towards close to 100% actually, because you recuperate the heat into the process. So that has the prospect of overall increasing that overall efficiency. But we also mustn't just focus on efficiency. Of course, efficiency matters, but so does cost, and so does functionality. And so it comes back to the points we've made earlier about where these systems start to play a role. And we, of course, we pay attention to efficiency, but it's not the only thing that matters. But Craig might want to just comment briefly on the fuel cell efficiency point.
So Craig,
no, I think you've covered it very well, Professor Brandon. Thermodynamics does play a role. You can't produce electricity without some heat in a fuel cell, and therefore you do have a lead on your electrical efficiency. So the only systems where you can enjoy a significantly higher overall system efficiency are those where you are able to use that heat.
Great. Dan, I'm going to ask you this question. What will fuel tomorrow's deep sea shipping? Is it liquid hydrogen, ammonia, LNG, or a mixture of all?
Well, if it's human shipping, it shouldn't be, in terms of a sustainable society and climate change target, it should be ammonia, low carbon ammonia. I mean, what I'd suggest is for people on the call, if you look at the Committee on Climate Change net zero report, the UK report, that the Committee on Climate Change are an independent advisor to UK government. They recommend that realistically maritime decarbonisation, heavy haulage, trains that often are economic to electrify, should be looking at hydrogen or potentially ammonia as a fuel source. Certainly in the maritime, probably ammonia. The thing we need to remember with liquid hydrogen in terms of shipping it is that doesn't actually exist at the moment. And the energy penalties and the technology, ammonia is shipped around the world, 2 million tonnes per year. It's a proven, understood technology. It's produced at scale. Obviously, it needs to be decarbonised. But, the Committee on Climate Change in the UK recognise that we need 225 terawatt hours of hydrogen by 2050 to have any chance of meeting net zero, and that we need to decarbonise maritime with clean ammonia. So, I think the key point here is it's not an argument about electric versus hydrogen. You need both, and you need both at massive scale. So we really need to just get on with deploying. And whichever end-use application is most appropriate is where they'll ultimately get diversity.
So we don't, thank you so much, Dan, and to our guest experts. I don't want to take too much of everybody's time. We said 50 minutes. We're almost there. I want to ask everybody that's still remaining on the call one last poll question. And again, this will appear on your screen. Do you think that the hydrogen economy is going through another cycle of hype, or do you think that hydrogen is here to stay? So either click A for hype or click B for here to stay, and we would really appreciate it. I'll give you a few seconds to respond. Okay, I see that more is here to stay, but not everyone has voted. It's continuing. Please go ahead. As you're voting, and please continue to vote, this is important to us. I just want to thank everyone. This has been very interesting, especially to our 3 guest experts. The council will follow up with organizing a few workshops and a few innovation forums in different regions of the world to encourage policymakers and investors and innovators to have a serious look into the success factors of hydrogen, because we do think that this is an enabler to decarbonization, and we all know that we have to move in that direction to make sure that we have an affordable, reliable, and secure decarbonization. If you have any questions for us, you have our emails. Please don't hesitate to contact us. And with that, we're at 50 minutes. We thank you very much, and we hope to stay connected with you. Thank you, everybody. Bye.
Thank you a lot. Thank you very much.
Thank you.